Hello, everyone. I'm Mr. Edison, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful slumber. If you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is as you unwind. So settle in, get cozy, and let the relaxation begin. I was 26 years old that October when everything changed. The date was October 15th, 2024, and I'd just moved into the rental house on Maple Ridge Road, about 15 miles outside of town. The isolation felt perfect after the chaos of city life. Nothing but pine trees, rolling hills, and the occasional wildlife passing through my yard. That Tuesday afternoon started like any other. I'd called in sick to work, nursing what I thought was just a head cold, and spent most of the day wrapped in blankets on my second-hand couch. The television droned on with daytime programming I wasn't really watching, just background noise to fill the oppressive quiet of the countryside. Around 3 o'clock, movement outside caught my peripheral vision. Through the sliding glass door that led to my back deck, I spotted them. 5 deer picking their way across the yellowing grass of my yard. White-tailed deer were common in this area, so the sight should have been unremarkable. I'd seen dozens since moving here 2 weeks ago, but something made me reach for the remote and mute the television. The silence that followed felt different than the usual rural quiet. It pressed against my eardrums like cotton, thick and unnatural. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, no distant traffic hum. Just the muffled sound of my own breathing fogging up the glass as I leaned closer to watch. The deer moved with their typical cautious grace, heads bobbing up to scan for threats before lowering to crop the grass. 3 does and 2 young bucks, all healthy-looking with thick autumn coats, normal in every way except I squinted, pressing my face against the cool glass. Something about the way the largest doe was walking didn't look right. Her left rear leg seemed to bend at an odd angle with each step, not quite following the natural movement I'd expect. At first I thought maybe she'd been injured, perhaps struck by a car or caught in a fence. But as I watched more closely, the anomaly became harder to dismiss. The joint appeared to bend backward, then forward, then sideways, in a slow, deliberate motion that made my stomach tighten. It wasn't the jerky, protective movement of an injured animal. It was fluid, controlled, almost experimental. I rubbed my eyes, certain the fever was making me see things. When I looked again, the doe had moved closer to the house, and now I could see her movement pattern more clearly. The leg wasn't just bending wrong, it was bending in directions that violated basic anatomy. The knee joint seemed to rotate completely around with each step, as if the bones and ligaments had become liquid. My mouth went dry. I blinked hard several times, waiting for the hallucination to correct itself. But the doe continued her impossible gait, and now I noticed the other deer were exhibiting similar distortions. The smaller buck's front legs appeared to elongate as he walked, stretching like taffy being pulled. His neck, too, seemed to extend and contract rhythmically. The fever, I told myself, had to be the fever. I pressed my hand to my forehead. It felt warm, but not burning. The thermometer I'd used that morning had read only 99.8 degrees, hardly enough to cause vivid hallucinations, but what I was seeing couldn't be real. The deer continued grazing, seemingly unaware that their bodies were defying the laws of physics. The largest doe lifted her head and looked directly at me through the glass door. Her eyes appeared larger than they should be, taking up too much of her face, and they held an intelligence that made the hair on my arms stand up. She stared at me for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then she opened her mouth and made a sound. It wasn't the snort or grunt I'd expect from a deer. It was a low, resonant moan that seemed to come from deep in her chest, a sound that vibrated through the glass and into my bones. The other deer didn't react to it at all, just continued their strange, fluid grazing. I stumbled backward from the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sound had been wrong on a fundamental level, like hearing a familiar song played in a minor key. It carried a note of something almost human, but distorted beyond recognition. When I looked outside again, all 5 deer had stopped eating and were staring at the house. Their necks had stretched impossibly long, their heads now hovering 3 feet above their bodies like balloons on strings. Yet they maintained perfect balance, their malformed legs supporting these grotesque proportions without any apparent strain. I wanted to run, to get as far from the window as possible, but I found myself frozen in place. The deer began to move again, but their locomotion had changed completely. They flowed across the grass like liquid, their limbs undulating in waves rather than taking discrete steps. Their bodies seemed to elongate and contract like accordions, maintaining their basic deer-like shape while constantly shifting in size and proportion. As they moved toward the tree line at the edge of my property, their forms became even more distorted. The does grew taller and thinner, their legs extending until they resembled grotesque stilts. The bucks became shorter and wider, their bodies compressing like sponges being squeezed. By the time they reached the shadows beneath the pine trees, they barely looked like deer at all. They were flowing, shifting silhouettes that hurt to look at directly. My brain kept trying to categorize what I was seeing, to force it into familiar patterns. But the images slipped away like water through fingers. The last one to disappear, the doe who had stared at me, paused at the forest's edge and turned back. Even from 50 yards away, I could feel the weight of her gaze. She opened her mouth again, and this time the sound that emerged was unmistakably human. "Help us." The words carried clearly across the yard, spoken in a woman's voice filled with anguish and desperation. Then she melted into the shadows between the trees, leaving me alone with the terrible silence. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those impossible shapes flowing across my yard like living nightmares. The woman's voice, if it had been a woman's voice, echoed in my head until I began to question whether I'd heard anything at all. By morning, I'd convinced myself it had all been a fever dream. The rational part of my mind, the part that had gotten me through college and into a decent job as a data analyst, insisted that deer don't bend like rubber, and they certainly don't speak English. I'd been sick, probably dehydrated, and my brain had conjured the entire episode. I made coffee and toast, forcing myself to go through normal morning routines. The sunlight streaming through the kitchen window looked ordinary enough, revealing a perfectly normal yard with perfectly normal grass and perfectly normal pine trees. No signs of the surreal parade I thought I'd witnessed. But when I opened the sliding door to step onto the deck with my coffee, I found the hoof prints. They were pressed deep into the soft earth of my flower bed, much deeper than they should have been, for animals that couldn't have weighed more than 150 pounds each. But it was the shape of the prints that made my hands shake so badly I nearly dropped my mug. They were elongated, stretched out like someone had taken normal deer tracks and pulled them through wet clay. Some were nearly a foot long, others compressed into tight circles no bigger than quarters. A few appeared to overlap in impossible ways, as if the same hoof had struck the ground multiple times in the exact same spot without lifting. I knelt down and touched one of the larger prints. The earth was packed hard as concrete, compressed with a force that should have required hydraulic pressure. When I tried to push my finger into the dirt beside it, I barely made an indentation. Standing up too quickly made me dizzy. I gripped the deck railing and tried to process what I was seeing. Either these tracks were evidence that last night had been real, or I was having a complete psychological breakdown. Neither option offered much comfort. I spent the rest of the morning on my laptop, searching for explanations. Deer leg deformities brought up articles about chronic wasting disease and various genetic conditions. Unusual animal behavior led me down rabbit holes about rabies, parasites, and environmental toxins. Nothing came close to describing what I'd witnessed. Around noon, I tried calling the state wildlife department. The woman who answered listened patiently as I described some unusual deer behavior in my area. But when I started to explain the specifics, her responses became increasingly skeptical. She suggested I might have seen elk or even horses in the distance, and that lighting conditions could create optical illusions. I hung up without mentioning the voice or the impossible hoofprints. The afternoon stretched endlessly. I found myself checking the windows every few minutes, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The yard remained empty, but the silence felt oppressive. Even the normal sounds of rural life, distant tractors, barking dogs, the occasional car on the main road, seemed muffled and far away. Around 4 o'clock, my neighbor pulled into his driveway. Jerome was a retired farmer in his 70s who'd lived on the adjacent property for 40 years. He'd been friendly when I moved in, offering to help with yard work and sharing vegetables from his garden. If anyone would know about unusual animal activity in the area, it would be him. I walked over and found him unloading groceries from his pickup truck. He smiled when he saw me approaching, but the expression faltered when he got a good look at my face. "You feeling all right, son? You look like you haven't slept in a week." "I'm fine," I lied. "Just wondering if you've noticed anything strange with the local wildlife lately. Deer acting oddly, maybe?" Jerome set down a bag of groceries and studied me with sharp blue eyes. "What kind of odd behavior?" I struggled to find words that wouldn't make me sound insane. "Movement patterns that seem unusual. Maybe some kind of disease affecting their coordination." He was quiet for a long moment, his expression growing serious. "You saw them, didn't you?" The simple question hit me like a physical blow.
"Saw what?"
"The bent ones." He glanced toward my property, then back at me. "They showed up about 3 weeks ago. Started with just one, a young buck with legs that moved wrong. Thought he'd been hit by a car, but..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "But what?" "But injured animals don't usually get worse over time. And they don't travel in groups." Jerome picked up his groceries and started toward his house. "You should probably stay inside after dark for a while." "Jerome, wait." I followed him up his porch steps. "What exactly have you seen?" He paused with his hand on the door handle. "Things I don't like to talk about. Things that make me sound crazy." He looked at me again, and I saw fear in his weathered features. "But if you've seen them too, maybe I'm not as crazy as I thought. Have you reported this to anyone?" Jerome let out a bitter laugh.
"Sure did."
"Called the Wildlife Department, the county sheriff, even the Agricultural Extension Office. Know what they told me? Same thing they probably told you. Lighting tricks and imagination. But you know what you saw." "I know that I've been living in these hills for 7 decades, and I've never seen anything like what's been happening lately." He opened his door, then paused. "You want some advice? Get yourself a gun and don't go outside alone after sunset. Whatever those things are, they're not natural." He went inside, leaving me standing on his porch with more questions than answers. At least I wasn't alone in this. Jerome had seen them too. But somehow that knowledge made everything worse instead of better. If 2 rational adults were witnessing the same impossible phenomena, then either we were both losing our minds, or something genuinely terrifying was happening in these woods. I walked home as the sun began to set, and for the first time since moving to the country, I locked my doors. The next day brought no relief from the growing dread that had settled in my chest like a stone. I called in sick to work again, claiming my flu had worsened, but the truth was, I couldn't concentrate on anything except the mystery of the bent ones. Jerome's warning echoed in my mind. They're not natural. I spent the morning diving deeper into online research, this time expanding my search beyond normal wildlife behavior. If conventional explanations weren't working, maybe I needed to look at unconventional possibilities. That's when I stumbled across a series of forum posts on a website dedicated to unexplained phenomena. The thread was titled "Anatomical Anomalies in Rural Pennsylvania," and it had been active for just over a month. My heart rate spiked as I read through the entries. User Chester County resident posted, "Saw 3 deer yesterday that moved like their bones were made of rubber. Legs bending in impossible directions. Anyone else experiencing this?" Farm Life 2019 replied, "Yes. Same thing here about 20 miles north of Chester County. Thought I was losing my mind." They make sounds too, don't they? Sounds that aren't quite animal? Gunter Hunter responded. My trail cameras caught some footage last week. Can't make sense of what I'm seeing. The deer appear normal in daylight photos, but the night vision videos show something else entirely. I scrolled through dozens of similar accounts, each one describing encounters remarkably similar to mine. The geographical pattern was disturbing. All the sightings were concentrated in a roughly 50-mile radius of rural southeastern Pennsylvania, with the earliest reports dating back about 6 weeks. But it was the final post in the thread that made my blood pressure spike. Naturalist Ned wrote, "For those brave enough to investigate further, there's a research facility about 15 miles south of the main cluster of sightings. Meridian Biological Research. They do work with genetic modification and environmental testing. Might be worth looking into their recent activities. Meridian Biological Research." I'd never heard of them, but a quick web search revealed a sparse corporate website listing environmental consulting and biotechnology services. Their address placed them less than 20 miles from my house. I grabbed my car keys. The drive to Meridian took me through increasingly remote countryside, past farms that looked abandoned and forests that seemed darker than they should in the middle of the day. The facility itself was smaller than I'd expected, just a cluster of prefabricated buildings surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. A guard station stood empty at the entrance, but the gate was open. Warning signs covered the fence. Authorized personnel only, biological hazard, no trespassing. I parked on the shoulder of the access road and studied the complex through binoculars I'd brought from my hiking gear. The place looked deserted. No vehicles in the parking lot, no lights in the windows, no signs of activity. But as I watched, movement caught my eye near the rear of the compound. Something large and dark emerged from behind the farthest building, moving with that same impossible fluidity I'd witnessed in my yard. Even from a quarter-mile away, I could tell it wasn't quite a deer anymore. The proportions were wrong, stretched and compressed in ways that hurt to process visually. It moved across the open ground behind the buildings with a flowing gait that reminded me of oil spreading across water. Then another appeared. And another. Within minutes, I counted at least a dozen of the creatures moving around the facility like they owned the place. Some were clearly derived from deer, but others had proportions that suggested different origins, possibly dogs, possibly something larger. I lowered the binoculars with shaking hands. Whatever Meridian Biological Research had been doing, it had created something that was now spreading into the surrounding ecosystem. The bent ones weren't just sick animals. They were the result of human interference with nature. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop watching. Go home. You don't want to be here when they notice you." I spun around, scanning the empty road in both directions. No other cars, no visible observers. But someone was monitoring the facility. Someone who knew I was there. Another text arrived. "Check your rearview mirror." I looked, and my heart nearly stopped. One of the creatures stood in the road, about 100 yards behind my car. Even at that distance, I could see its neck extending upward like a periscope, its head turning in my direction. As I watched, its torso began to stretch vertically, growing taller and thinner until it resembled a grotesque telephone pole with legs. I gunned the engine and floored the accelerator, leaving rubber on the asphalt as I sped away from the facility. In my rearview mirror, I saw the creature collapse back to normal proportions and disappear into the roadside brush. The drive home passed in a blur of adrenaline and terror. Someone, or something, was orchestrating events around the research facility. The bent ones weren't just random mutants. They were being directed, controlled, and now they knew I'd been watching. That evening I called Jerome and asked if I could come over. I needed to tell someone what I'd discovered, and he was the only person who might believe me. When I arrived at his house, he was sitting on his porch with a shotgun across his lap. "They've been circling my property all afternoon," he said without preamble. "Haven't seen them this active during daylight before." I told him about the research facility, the forum posts, and my encounter on the access road. Jerome listened without interruption, his weathered face growing grimmer with each detail. "Genetic modification," he said when I finished. God almighty, what were they thinking? The facility looked abandoned. Maybe they lost control of whatever they created. Jerome shook his head. If someone texted you warnings, then somebody's still pulling the strings. Question is whether they're trying to contain this mess or make it worse. As if summoned by his words, both our phones chimed simultaneously with new messages from the same unknown number. Stay inside tonight. All of tonight. Don't look outside no matter what you hear. I met Jerome's eyes and saw my own fear reflected there. Whatever was coming, it was going to be worse than anything we'd witnessed so far. I should have gone home and followed the anonymous warning, but Jerome insisted I stay at his place. 2 pairs of eyes are better than one, he said, and 2 guns are better than 1 gun. He'd armed me with an old hunting rifle from his collection, though I had serious doubts about whether conventional weapons would be effective against creatures that could reshape their own anatomy. We settled in for what promised to be the longest night of our lives. Jerome's house was built like a fortress, thick stone walls, small windows, and heavy wooden doors that he'd reinforced with steel bars. He'd been preparing for this confrontation longer than I'd realized. "How long have you known about the research facility?" I asked as we positioned ourselves in his living room, with views of both my property and his. "Found it 2 weeks ago," Jerome replied, checking his shotgun for the 10th time. "Drove out there after the 3rd time I saw those things in my pasture. Place was already abandoned by then, but the damage was done." Outside, the sun had set completely, leaving us in the kind of darkness that only exists in rural areas far from city lights. The silence was absolute. No insects, no night birds, no small animals rustling through the undergrowth. Even the ever-present whisper of wind through the pine trees had stopped. "They're coming," Jerome whispered. "At first, I didn't see anything. Then movement caught my eye near the tree line behind my house. Shapes emerged from the shadows between the pines, but they weren't moving like any animal I'd ever seen. They flowed across the open ground like spilled mercury, their forms constantly shifting and reforming." "How many?" I asked, though my voice came out as barely a croak. Jerome was counting under his breath. 12, 15. "Still coming," he paused. 23 total. More than I've ever seen together. The creatures spread out across both our properties in what appeared to be a coordinated formation. Some remained roughly deer-shaped, while others had taken on proportions that defied classification. One near my deck had grown to the size of a small horse, its legs stretched impossibly thin to support its enlarged torso. Another had compressed itself into something resembling a giant slug with antlers, but it was their behavior that truly chilled me. They weren't grazing or exhibiting any typical animal patterns. Instead, they seemed to be searching. Their elongated necks swayed back and forth like periscopes as they methodically examined every inch of our properties. "They're looking for us," I realized. "Hunting us," Jerome corrected grimly. One of the creatures approached Jerome's house, its head extending upward until it reached the level of our 2nd-story windows. Through the glass I could see its eyes, no longer the simple dark eyes of a deer, but complex organs with multiple pupils that moved independently of each other. It studied the window with an intelligence that was undeniably human. Then it spoke. "We know you're in there." The voice was clearer than the previous day, a perfect female contralto that might have belonged to a news anchor or telephone operator. "We need to talk to you about what you've seen." Jerome and I exchanged glances. Neither of us moved or made a sound. "We're not going to hurt you," the creature continued. "We just want to explain what's happening, to help you understand." Other creatures had begun to gather around Jerome's house, their forms shifting and flowing as they took positions that would block all the exits. Some had grown additional limbs, arms that emerged from their torsos like tree branches, ending in hands with too many fingers. Others had developed multiple heads that whispered to each other in languages I couldn't identify. "Please," the creature at the window said. "We used to be like you. We remember what it was like to be human." The words hit me like a physical blow. These weren't mutated deer, they were mutated people. The research facility hadn't been experimenting on animals. They'd been experimenting on human subjects. The implications made my stomach turn. "What did they do to you?" I called out before Jerome could stop me. The creature's multiple eyes focused on the sound of my voice. They promised us enhancement, adaptation, evolution beyond the limitations of fixed anatomy. Its voice carried infinite sadness. They gave us the ability to change our bodies at will, but they couldn't control the process. "We kept changing and we can't stop." "How many of you are there?" 47 in our group, more scattered throughout the region. Some have changed so much they can no longer communicate. The creature's form shuddered, its neck contracting and expanding like a bellows. "We're trying to find the researchers who did this to us, to make them reverse the process." "They're gone," Jerome said, finally speaking up. "The facility's been abandoned." "No." This came from multiple creatures simultaneously, their voices creating an eerie harmony. "They're still here, watching, waiting to see how far the changes will progress." One of the smaller creatures approached the front door, its body compressing until it could fit through the gap beneath the frame. I watched in horror as it flowed under the door like liquid, then reformed on Jerome's entryway. Up close, I could see that its hide was translucent, revealing organs that pulsed and shifted like living machinery. "They're inside the mountain," it said, extending what might have been a finger to point south toward the distant hills. "Deep underground, still running their experiments. What do you want from us?" Jerome demanded, keeping his shotgun trained on the creature. "Help us find them. Help us get our lives back." The creature's voice was that of a young man, probably in his 20s. "We can't do this alone. We need normal humans who can go places we can't, ask questions we can't ask. And if we refuse..." The creature that had been speaking through the window pressed closer to the glass. "Then you'll become like us. The genetic modifications are airborne now. Everyone in a 50-mile radius has been exposed. The only question is how long before the changes begin." My rifle clattered to the floor as the full horror of the situation hit me. We weren't just witnessing an isolated incident. We were part of an ongoing experiment. The entire region had been contaminated, and the transformations were spreading. "How long do we have?" I asked. "Based on our experiences, the first changes begin within 72 hours of exposure," the creature replied. "You've both been exposed for at least a week. The process will begin soon." Jerome lowered his shotgun, his face pale with defeat. "God help us all." "God can't help us now," the creature said sadly. "But maybe you can help us stop this before it spreads any further." Outside, the other creatures had begun to flow back toward the tree line, their reconnaissance apparently complete. Only the one inside remained, its translucent form pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that hadn't been there moments before. "Think about what we've told you," it said. "We'll return tomorrow night for your answer. And remember, whether you help us or not, you're already part of this now." The creature compressed itself and flowed back under the door, leaving Jerome and me alone with the terrible knowledge that our transformation had already begun. I didn't return to my own house that night. Jerome and I sat in his kitchen until dawn, drinking coffee and trying to process what we'd learned. Every small sensation, a muscle twitch, a joint ache, an unusual hunger pang, sent waves of paranoia through both of us. Were these the first signs of change, or just normal bodily functions amplified by fear? "We need to get out of here," I said, as the first grey light filtered through the windows. "Drive somewhere far away, maybe find a doctor who can help us." Jerome shook his head. 72 hours, they said. "If we've been exposed for a week, running won't change anything. And if this thing is airborne, we might just spread it to wherever we go." He was right, but the thought of staying here, waiting for our bodies to betray us, felt like surrender. I found myself examining my hands obsessively, looking for any sign that my fingers were beginning to elongate or my joints were becoming too flexible. Around 8 in the morning, my phone rang. The caller ID showed my supervisor's number. "Where the hell are you?" Kevin's voice was sharp with irritation. "You've missed 3 days this week, and the Henderson report was due yesterday." For a moment, I couldn't remember what the Henderson report was, or why it had ever seemed important. The normal world of deadlines and meetings felt like something from another lifetime. "I'm sick," I managed. "Some kind of virus. I think I need to take extended leave." Extended leave. You've been here 8 months. You don't have enough vacation time built up for extended leave? Then I quit. The words came out before I'd consciously decided to say them, but they felt right. What was the point of pretending my old life still mattered when I might not be human much longer? I hung up and turned off my phone. Jerome nodded approvingly. "Good," he said. "We're going to need all our focus for what's coming." We spent the morning researching the underground facility the creatures had mentioned. Topographical maps showed an extensive cave system running through the mountains south of our location, with several old mining tunnels that had been abandoned decades ago. If the researchers had established a hidden laboratory, those caves would be the logical location. But first, we needed to understand exactly what we were dealing with. I convinced Jerome to drive back to the Meridian facility with me, this time prepared for a closer investigation. The research complex looked even more desolate in daylight. Windows stared blindly from the prefabricated buildings, and weeds had already begun to grow through cracks in the parking lot asphalt. But the chain-link fence hummed with electricity, suggesting the place wasn't as abandoned as it appeared. We parked a safe distance away and approached on foot, keeping to the tree line. Jerome had brought bolt cutters from his farm, and we found a section of fence hidden from the main buildings where we could create an opening. "Motion sensors," Jerome whispered, pointing to small devices mounted on poles throughout the compound. "They know we're here, but no security appeared to challenge us." We moved quickly between buildings, trying to find an unlocked entrance. Most of the doors required electronic keycards, but a service entrance near the rear had been left propped open with a brick. The interior of the building was a maze of sterile corridors and empty laboratories. Equipment had been removed, but not all of it. Centrifuges, incubators, and computer workstations remained scattered throughout the facility. More importantly, we found documentation. In a file cabinet that had been overlooked during the evacuation, I discovered a stack of research reports dated from 6 months ago. The project was called Adaptive Morphology Initiative, and the goal was exactly what the creatures had described: developing humans who could modify their physical form at will. "Listen to this," I said, reading from one of the reports. Phase 3 trials will involve 30 subjects exposed to concentrated AMI serum in a controlled environment. Subjects will be monitored for morphological changes over a 6-week period. Jerome looked over my shoulder at the document. 30 subjects. The creature said there were 47 in their group. Maybe some didn't survive the process, I suggested, though the thought made me sick. I kept reading. The reports detailed a progression of increasingly dramatic physical changes in the test subjects. Early modifications were minor: enhanced flexibility, accelerated healing, improved sensory perception. But as the serum accumulated in their systems, the changes became more extreme and less controllable. Subject 15 demonstrates ability to extend limb length by up to 300%, I read aloud. However, subject reports significant pain and difficulty returning to baseline proportions. Recommend reducing serum concentration for future trials. The final report in the file was dated 8 weeks ago, just before the first sightings of bent ones in the area. It described a catastrophic failure of the containment protocols. Multiple subjects have breached security barriers, the report stated. Morphological adaptations now include partial liquefaction of bone structure, allowing passage through openings as small as 4 inches in diameter. Facility evacuation is recommended until enhanced containment measures can be implemented. They lost control of their own test subjects, Jerome said grimly. And instead of cleaning up the mess, they just ran. But the most disturbing part was yet to come. The final page of the report contained a list of secondary exposure protocols, procedures for monitoring individuals who had come into contact with the escaped subjects. Environmental dispersion of AMI compounds through exhaled vapors, I read. All residents within a 50-mile radius should be considered potentially exposed. Recommend establishing covert observation posts to document progression of secondary infections. Jerome and I stared at each other as the implications sank in. We weren't just accidentally exposed. We were part of a deliberate study. The researchers hadn't abandoned the project. They'd simply moved it to a larger laboratory, the entire surrounding region. A sound from somewhere deeper in the building made us both freeze. Footsteps echoed through the empty corridors, slow and deliberate. Someone else was in the facility. We grabbed the files and moved toward the exit, but the footsteps were getting closer. Jerome pulled out his handgun. He'd insisted on bringing it despite my protests about the dangers of firearms in a confined space. This way, he whispered, leading me down a side corridor toward what looked like an emergency exit. But as we rounded the corner, we came face to face with our pursuer. It was a woman in a white lab coat, maybe 40 years old, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. She looked completely normal except for her eyes, which held the same multi-pupilled complexity I'd seen in the creatures outside Jerome's house. "Dr. Amanda Price," she said, extending a hand that had too many joints in the fingers. "I've been hoping to meet you two. You're exactly the kind of subjects we need for the next phase of our research." Dr. Price's smile revealed teeth that were too sharp and too numerous, filling her mouth like rows of needles. Despite her grotesque modifications, she moved with the confident authority of someone accustomed to being in control. "Please don't run," she said as Jerome raised his gun. "I'm not here to hurt you. Quite the opposite, actually. I'm here to offer you a choice. The same choice you offered the others?" I demanded, clutching the stolen files against my chest. "The others volunteered," Dr. Price replied smoothly. "They were terminally ill patients who chose experimental treatment over certain death. The fact that their transformations exceeded our projections was unexpected." Jerome kept his weapon trained on her. "What kind of choice are you talking about? You've both been exposed to AMI compounds for 9 days now. The changes will begin within the next 24 hours, whether you cooperate with us or not." She gestured toward the files I was holding. "I see you've done your homework. You understand what's coming. We understand that you're conducting illegal human experiments," I said. Dr. Price laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Illegal according to whose laws? The FDA, the Geneva Convention? Those regulations were written for a world where human biology was fixed and unchangeable. We're pioneering a new era of human evolution. You're creating monsters. I'm creating the next phase of human development." Her expression grew serious. "Climate change, resource depletion, overpopulation, traditional human anatomy is inadequate for the challenges our species will face in the coming decades. We need bodies that can adapt, that can survive in environments where fixed-form humans would perish." Jerome's gun hand was starting to shake. "And you decided to test this theory on unwilling subjects. The volunteers knew the risks," Dr. Price insisted. "And now we're offering you the same opportunity they had. Join our research program voluntarily, and we can guide your transformation. Let us help you adapt gradually, with minimal discomfort. And if we refuse, then you'll change on your own, without any medical support or guidance. The process will be painful, unpredictable, and quite possibly fatal." She stepped closer, seemingly unconcerned about Jerome's weapon. "I've seen what uncontrolled transformation looks like. It's not pleasant. I thought about the creatures we'd encountered, their obvious pain and confusion. What happened to your original volunteers? The ones from the facility? They're adapting beautifully, Dr. Price said, learning to control their new abilities, exploring the boundaries of what human anatomy can become. They're the first generation of truly post-human beings. They told us they want to be changed back. Dr. Price's smile faltered for the first time. Temporary psychological adjustment issues. It's understandable that they would experience some regret during the transition period, but given time, they'll come to appreciate what they've become. Jerome finally spoke up. Where are you conducting these experiments now? I think you already know the answer to that question. Dr. Price gestured toward the south, in the direction of the mountains. We have a much better facility now. More space, better security, advanced equipment. Everything we need to perfect the process. How many more test subjects are you planning to collect? As many as it takes to ensure human survival, she replied without hesitation. This region represents the largest field trial of AMI compounds in human history. We have nearly 3,000 potential subjects to study over the coming months. The number hit me like a physical blow. 3,000 people, all unknowingly exposed to an experimental serum that would fundamentally alter their biology. Children, elderly people, entire families, all of them marked for transformation whether they consented or not. You're insane, I whispered. I'm visionary, Dr. Price corrected. And you have 15 minutes to decide whether you want to be part of the future of human evolution or whether you'd prefer to face that future alone. She turned and walked away, her movements displaying the same fluid grace we'd observed in the other transformed subjects. Her legs bent at impossible angles with each step, allowing her to navigate the corridor with an efficiency that no normal human could match. Jerome lowered his gun with shaking hands. What do we do? I looked down at the files I was still clutching. The research reports contained detailed information about the underground facility, including maps of the tunnel systems and security protocols. If we could reach the right authorities, the FBI, the CDC, maybe even the military, we might be able to stop this madness before it spread beyond the current test area. We get this information to people who can shut them down, I said. And if we start changing before help arrives? I didn't have an answer for that question. The transformation timeline suggested we had less than 24 hours before our own modifications began. Even if we could reach outside authorities immediately, there was no guarantee they would believe us or act quickly enough to matter. But as we made our way back to Jerome's truck, I noticed something that gave me hope. My hands, which I'd been obsessively monitoring for signs of change, looked exactly the same as they had that morning. No elongated fingers, no additional joints, no unusual flexibility. Maybe the 72-hour timeline was just a psychological weapon, designed to make potential subjects surrender before their transformation actually began. Maybe we still had time to fight back. We drove away from the facility in silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. But as we reached the main road, I made a decision that would determine the course of everything that followed. We're going to that underground lab, I announced. Jerome nearly drove off the road. Are you out of your mind? That place will be crawling with security, not to mention whatever other experiments they're running down there. It's the only way to get proof that outside authorities will believe, I explained. Photos, video footage, maybe even physical evidence of what they're doing. Without that, we're just two guys with a crazy story about shape-shifting deer. Huh? And if we get caught? Then we become permanent test subjects instead of temporary ones, I admitted. But if we don't try, 3,000 people are going to suffer the same fate as those volunteers. Jerome was quiet for several miles, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Finally, he nodded. When do we go? Tonight, I said. Before our own changes begin, and before Dr. Price realizes we're not planning to cooperate. As we pulled into Jerome's driveway, I felt a strange tingling sensation in my fingertips. It was probably just nerves, I told myself, just the anxiety of planning what might be a suicide mission. But deep down, I knew our time as normal humans was running out. We spent the afternoon preparing for what we both knew might be our final mission as unchanged humans. Jerome had an impressive collection of survival gear accumulated from decades of hunting and farming: night vision goggles, rope climbing equipment, waterproof cameras, and enough ammunition to fight a small war. I focused on studying the facility, maps we'd stolen, memorizing the tunnel layouts, and identifying the most likely locations for a hidden laboratory. The cave system was extensive, with multiple levels connected by both natural passages and man-made tunnels from the old mining operations. "Main access point is here," I said, pointing to a marked entrance about 3 miles into the mountains. "But there are at least 4 other ways in, including an old mine shaft that might not be monitored." Jerome looked up from cleaning his rifle. "How do we know they haven't sealed the other entrances?" "We don't. But if Dr. Price is running a major research operation down there, she'll need multiple escape routes in case of emergency. Basic facility security protocols." As the sun began to set, I noticed the tingling in my hands had spread to my forearms. When I flexed my fingers, the joints felt looser than they should, as if the cartilage was beginning to soften. Jerome was experiencing similar symptoms. He kept rolling his shoulders and stretching his neck, trying to relieve what he described as a deep ache in his bones. "It's starting," he said grimly, as we loaded gear into his pickup truck. "Then we better hurry." The drive to the mountains took us through increasingly remote terrain. We passed several abandoned farmhouses and empty fields that should have been bustling with autumn harvest activity. The AMI contamination had apparently affected more than just the immediate area around our homes. We parked at the end of a logging road, about a mile from the old mine shaft entrance. The hike through the forest was treacherous in the dark, even with night vision equipment. Ancient trees blocked out most of the moonlight, and the undergrowth was thick with thorns and fallen branches. But the worst part was the silence. The woods should have been alive with night sounds: owls calling, small animals rustling through the leaves, insects chirping in the darkness. Instead, we moved through a dead zone, where nothing stirred except the wind. "They're watching us," Jerome whispered as we approached the mine entrance. I didn't see anything, but I felt it too, the weight of unseen eyes tracking our progress. The transformed subjects Dr. Price had created were somewhere in these woods, probably reporting our every move to their handlers underground. The mine shaft entrance was partially concealed by a steel grate that had been installed decades ago to keep out trespassers. But someone had recently cut through the metal bars, leaving an opening just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "Recent modification," Jerome observed, running his fingers along the clean cuts in the steel. "They're definitely using this entrance." We activated our recording equipment and began the descent into the mountain. The tunnel sloped downward at a steep angle, supported by rotting timber beams that creaked ominously under the weight of tons of rock above our heads. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling, creating puddles that reflected our flashlight beams like mirrors. After 20 minutes of careful progress, we reached a junction where the old mining tunnel intersected with what was clearly a modern excavation. Smooth concrete walls replaced the rough-hewn stone, and fluorescent lighting fixtures had been installed along the ceiling. "This way," I whispered, following the newer tunnel toward what the stolen maps indicated was the main laboratory complex. The passage led us deeper underground, past heavily reinforced doors marked with biohazard symbols and warnings in multiple languages. Through reinforced windows, we caught glimpses of empty holding cells and abandoned equipment. Whatever had been happening in these rooms, it had been moved to a different location, Then we heard the voices. Multiple people were talking somewhere ahead of us, their words echoing through the tunnel system in a way that made it impossible to determine exact numbers or locations. We moved more cautiously, using every shadow and alcove to remain hidden as we approached the source of the sound. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber that had been carved from the living rock. The space was easily the size of an aircraft hangar, with multiple levels connected by metal catwalks and spiral staircases. High-tech equipment filled every available surface: computers, medical monitors, tanks containing unidentifiable specimens, and machines whose purpose I couldn't even guess. But it was the occupants of the chamber that made my blood freeze. Dr. Price stood at the center of the facility, but she was no longer even remotely human. Her body had elongated to nearly 8 feet in height, with arms that stretched like rubber bands as she operated multiple computer terminals simultaneously. Her head had flattened and widened, allowing room for dozens of eyes that moved independently to monitor different sections of the laboratory. Around her worked at least 20 other figures that might once have been human. Some had developed additional limbs that sprouted from their torsos like tree branches. Others had modified their sensory organs: enlarged ears, extended tongues, clusters of eyes growing from their necks and shoulders. All of them moved with the same fluid efficiency we'd observed in the creatures outside our homes. Subject population is responding as projected, Dr. Price was saying, her voice now a harmonic blend of multiple tones. Transformation rates exceed 90% within the target zone. We should begin Phase 4 within the next 72 hours. What about the holdouts? Asked another researcher whose face had been replaced by a mass of sensory tentacles. The two who refused cooperation? Dr. Price's multitude of eyes focused on a bank of monitors showing surveillance footage from around our homes. They're currently approaching sub-level 3. Their transformation has already begun. Note the increased joint flexibility and tissue elasticity. By the time they reach this chamber, they'll be ready for direct integration. I looked down at my hands and realized she was right. My fingers had elongated by at least 2 inches, and I could bend them in directions that should have been anatomically impossible. Jerome's neck had stretched to nearly twice its normal length, giving him an almost serpentine appearance. We were becoming like them whether we wanted to or not. Phase 4 parameters, the tentacled researcher continued. Expansion beyond the current containment zone, Dr. Price replied. Atmospheric dispersal of AMI compounds over a 500-mile radius. Complete transformation of the regional population within 6 months. The full scope of their plan hit me like a sledgehammer. They weren't just experimenting on isolated rural communities. They were planning to transform the entire eastern seaboard. Millions of people would be affected, all of them changed into something that barely qualified as human. Jerome and I exchanged glances, and I saw my own determination reflected in his elongated features. We had to stop this, even if it meant sacrificing ourselves in the process. I pulled out one of the explosive charges Jerome had brought from his farm, originally intended for clearing tree stumps, but powerful enough to collapse sections of the tunnel system. If we could destroy the laboratory and seal the facility, we might be able to contain the contamination and prevent the larger catastrophe. But as I prepared to set the timer, Dr. Price's multiple eyes suddenly focused directly on our hiding spot. "Welcome to the future," she said, her harmonious voice carrying clearly across the chamber. "Please come down and join us. Your transformation is nearly complete, and we have so much work to do together." Security doors slammed shut throughout the facility, cutting off all our escape routes. We were trapped in the heart of their operation, surrounded by creatures that had once been human, with our own humanity slipping away by the minute. The final phase of our transformation was about to begin, and we were powerless to stop it. The explosive charge felt impossibly heavy in my hands as Jerome and I emerged from our hiding place. Around us, the transformed researchers had stopped their work and turned to watch our descent into the main laboratory chamber. Their modifications were even more disturbing up close. Some had developed multiple heads that whispered to each other in languages that hurt to hear, while others had replaced their limbs entirely with tentacles or segmented appendages that resembled insect legs. Dr. Price approached us with movements that defied basic physics, her elongated form flowing down the metal staircase like liquid mercury. Up close, I could see that her multiple eyes weren't just clustered on her face, they emerged from every part of her body, creating a living surveillance system that could monitor all directions simultaneously. "You're handling the transition remarkably well," she said, her voice now a choir of harmonized tones. "Most subjects experience significant psychological distress during the initial morphological changes." I looked down at myself and nearly vomited. My arms had stretched to nearly twice their normal length, and my fingers had become so elongated they resembled the legs of a giant spider. Jerome's transformation was even more advanced. His torso had compressed while his limbs extended, giving him the proportions of a grotesque scarecrow. "What have you done to us?" Jerome's voice came out as a wet, bubbling sound. His vocal cords had apparently been modified along with everything else. "We've given you the gift of adaptation," Dr. Price replied. "Your bodies are no longer constrained by the arbitrary limitations of your original genetic code. You can become whatever the situation requires. We never consented to this." "Consent is a luxury humanity can no longer afford," she said dismissively. "The climate catastrophes of the next century will require radical physiological adaptation. Fixed-form humans simply won't survive the coming environmental changes." I forced my transformed hands to steady the explosive device, though my elongated fingers made it difficult to operate the timer mechanism. "Even if you're right about climate change, this isn't the answer. You're destroying human civilization." "I'm evolving it," Dr. Price corrected. "The volunteers you met outside, they're the first generation of post-human beings. They can survive in environments that would kill normal humans. They can modify their bodies to process different types of food, breathe in altered atmospheric conditions, even adapt to radiation exposure." "They can't change back," Jerome pointed out. "You've taken away their choice." Dr. Price's numerous eyes blinked in sequence, creating a rippling effect across her transformed features. "Choice is an illusion anyway. Environmental pressures will force adaptation, whether we guide the process or not. At least this way, the transition can be controlled and optimized." I managed to activate the timer on the explosive charge, setting it for 30 seconds. If I could get it close to the main power coupling for the facility, the explosion might damage enough equipment to shut down their operation. But 30 seconds felt like an eternity when you're surrounded by creatures that can reshape their anatomy at will. "You're planning something," Dr. Price observed, her eyes focusing on the device in my hands. "Please don't do anything destructive. You'll only hurt yourselves and delay the inevitable." "Maybe," I said, clutching the charge against my chest. "But at least we'll stop you from spreading this contamination any further." "Contamination?" Dr. Price laughed, the sound echoing through the chamber like breaking bells. "You still don't understand. The AMI compounds aren't a contamination, they're a vaccination. We're immunizing humanity against extinction." 20 seconds remaining on the timer. Around us, the other transformed researchers had begun to move closer, their modified bodies flowing and shifting as they prepared to restrain us. Some had developed additional arms that emerged from their backs like wings, while others had modified their leg structure to allow for rapid, spider-like movement across any surface. "The atmospheric release scheduled for tomorrow will affect nearly 2 million people," Dr. Price continued. "Within a year, we'll have expanded to cover the entire continental United States. Humanity will finally be free from the constraints of biological determinism. The Sudra Justicia Tuo." 15 seconds. Jerome had moved toward one of the computer terminals that controlled the facility's ventilation system. Even in his transformed state, his farming background gave him an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems. If he could reverse the airflow, maybe we could prevent the scheduled atmospheric release. "You can't stop evolution," Dr. Price said, extending one of her elongated arms toward the explosive device. "It's already too late. The process is irreversible." 10 seconds. I dodged away from her grasping fingers, my own transformed body moving with surprising agility. The elongated limbs that had seemed so grotesque actually provided enhanced leverage and reach. Maybe Dr. Price was right about the adaptive advantages, but that didn't justify forcing the change on unwilling subjects. 5 seconds. "Jerome, now!" I shouted, diving toward the main power coupling. My friend slammed his modified fist into the ventilation control panel, sending sparks flying as circuitry overloaded throughout the facility. Emergency lighting flickered on as the main power systems failed, and I heard the distant rumble of machinery shutting down in the tunnels above us. 3 seconds. Dr. Price lunged toward me with impossible speed, her body stretching like taffy as she tried to reach the explosive device. But she was too late. The charge detonated against the power coupling in a brilliant flash of light and sound that shook the entire underground complex. Concrete dust rained from the ceiling as support structures cracked and buckled. The high-tech equipment that filled the chamber sparked and died as electrical systems overloaded throughout the facility. In the chaos that followed, Jerome and I fought our way toward one of the secondary tunnels, using our modified bodies' enhanced agility to navigate the collapsing laboratory. The other researchers were more concerned with salvaging their equipment than pursuing us, and Dr. Price had been caught in the blast radius of the explosion. We emerged from the mountain just as dawn was breaking over the valley. Behind us, smoke poured from multiple cave entrances as the underground facility burned. The atmospheric release systems had been destroyed, and with them, Dr. Price's plan to transform the larger population. But our victory came at a cost. Jerome and I were permanently changed, our bodies locked into forms that were no longer entirely human. We could never return to our old lives, never fully integrate into normal society. As we walked away from the mountain, other transformed subjects emerged from the woods around us. The original volunteers Dr. Price had experimented on, now free from her control and grateful for what we'd done. They formed a community of the changed, supporting each other as they learned to live with their new abilities. We established a settlement in the abandoned town nearest to the destroyed facility, creating a place where the transformed could exist without fear or persecution. Some of us learned to control our modifications, developing useful adaptations that helped the community thrive. Others remained locked in their altered forms, serving as living reminders of the price of unchecked scientific ambition. The outside world never learned the full truth about what happened in those mountains. Official reports blamed the incidents on a contained chemical spill that required permanent evacuation of the affected area. But those of us who survived know better. We are the living proof that humanity's future is not fixed, that our species can adapt and evolve in ways both wonderful and terrible. The question is whether we'll have the wisdom to guide that evolution responsibly, or whether we'll repeat Dr. Price's mistakes on an even larger scale. For now, we watch and wait, guardians of a secret that could either save humanity or destroy it. And sometimes late at night when the wind carries strange sounds from the deeper parts of the forest, I wonder if we truly stopped Dr. Price's work, or if we simply delayed it for another generation to discover. The bent ones still walk among us, forever changed but not forgotten. We are the bridge between what humanity was and what it might become. And God help us all if we fail to choose the right path forward. The night shift at Westland Hospital always left me drained. By the time I pulled into my driveway at 1:30 a.m. on that October evening in 2024, the exhaustion had settled deep in my bones. At 34, I'd been working as an emergency room nurse for nearly a decade, but the late shifts still took their toll. My neighborhood in suburban Austin was exactly what you'd expect: rows of similar houses with manicured lawns, where the most exciting event was usually someone's sprinkler system malfunctioning. That particular Tuesday night had been brutal. A multi-car accident on the highway had kept our trauma team working non-stop. When I finally made it home, Ren was waiting anxiously by the door. My 3-year-old retriever mix was the only thing that greeted me at home since my divorce last year. Despite my fatigue, his expectant gaze was impossible to ignore. Our nightly walks had become more than routine. They were necessary for both of us. "Give me 5 minutes, buddy," I murmured, changing out of my scrubs into a pair of jeans and a thick sweater. The October air had turned unexpectedly cold, especially for Texas. Weather reports mentioned it was the earliest cold snap in years. I filled Ren's water bowl and grabbed his leash from the hook by the door. His tail wagged with such force that his entire body swayed. Okay, I laughed softly. "Just a short one tonight." The subdivision was quiet at this hour. Most families were tucked away in their beds, alarm clocks set for early morning commutes to Austin. My schedule had always been different from everyone else's. One of the many reasons my marriage had dissolved. Night shifts and odd hours meant I lived in the spaces between normal life, in the quiet moments when the world seemed to pause. As I locked the front door behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I scanned the street, seeing nothing but parked cars and darkened windows. The recent rain had left everything with a slick, glossy sheen. Streetlights created islands of visibility in the darkness, their glow reflecting off puddles and wet asphalt. "It's just us, Ren," I whispered, more to comfort myself than him. The night air felt unusually still, almost heavy with anticipation. I tightened my grip on the leash and stepped off my porch into the night. Our usual route took us through Oakshire Drive, past the community playground, and back around through Willow Lane. 20 minutes, just enough for Ren to take care of business, and for me to clear my head before attempting sleep. The neighborhood had always felt safe. Crime rates were low, neighbors looked out for one another, and most homes had security systems that flashed their tiny red lights like electronic guardians. Tonight, however, something felt off. The recent rain had washed away the usual suburban smells, leaving behind a raw, earthy scent that seemed to heighten my senses. Every sound became amplified: the dripping of water from tree branches, the distant hum of the highway beyond our subdivision, the soft pad of Ren's paws on wet pavement. We had made it about halfway through our route when the first tingle of unease crept up my spine. There were no footsteps, no voice, nothing tangible to explain the sudden alertness that gripped me. Just a visceral, primitive sense that we weren't alone. "Come on, boy," I urged Ren, quickening our pace slightly. He seemed oblivious to my growing discomfort, happily investigating every mailbox post and shrub with his usual thoroughness. The street ahead curved gently, disappearing behind a row of cedar elms. The streetlights here were spaced farther apart, creating pockets of darkness between their spheres of illumination. As we approached one such shadowy interval, I noticed the Jenkins motion sensor light was out. Their house sat dark and still, their driveway empty, probably on that Cancun vacation they'd been planning for months. I hesitated at the edge of the darkness. Something about that particular stretch of road made me want to turn back, to retreat to the safety of my well-lit porch. But that would mean walking all the way around the block, adding another 15 minutes to our journey. Exhaustion won out over caution. "It's nothing," I muttered to myself, stepping forward. Ren followed eagerly, untroubled by the shadows that seemed to reach for us with each step. The silence struck me as unnatural. No crickets chirping, no distant car doors slamming, not even the rustle of wind through the trees. Just the sound of our movement and my increasingly shallow breathing. I found myself straining to hear something, anything beyond our immediate vicinity. That's when I noticed a strange distortion in the air ahead, right at the edge of the next pool of light. At first, I thought it was just condensation from the recent rain, a wisp of fog perhaps. But as we drew closer, the shape solidified into something more substantial, a vertical silhouette standing motionless at the periphery of the streetlight's glow. Time seemed to slow as my eyes struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure stood perfectly still, as if planted in the concrete. From this distance, I could discern only the barest details. Tall, lean, wearing what appeared to be a dark coat that hung past their knees. The light from the street lamp hit them at an odd angle, casting more shadow than illumination. Rational explanations flooded my mind. A neighbor having a late-night cigarette, someone waiting for a ride, a fellow insomniac seeking relief in the night air. Yet none of these possibilities eased the growing knot of tension in my stomach. Ren, normally indifferent to strangers, suddenly tensed. His ears perked forward, his gait becoming stiffer, more alert. He didn't bark or growl, just watched with an intensity I rarely saw in him. "It's okay," I whispered, though I wasn't convinced myself. We were still about 50 yards from the figure, close enough to see but not to distinguish features. I considered crossing the street, but realized that would make my discomfort obvious. Plus, there was something about turning my back on this person that felt deeply wrong. I maintained our pace, neither slowing nor speeding up, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. As we drew closer, more details emerged. The figure wore glasses, round ones that caught the light and reflected it back in twin circles of brightness. Their stance was peculiar, feet planted slightly apart, as if braced for impact. At 30 yards, I realized the figure was watching us intently. There was no phone in hand, no distraction, just a focused stillness directed entirely at our approach. My mouth went dry. The neighborhood's silence seemed to deepen, as if everything around us was holding its breath. I tightened my grip on Ren's leash, the material digging into my palm. 20 yards now. I could make out more: dark hair, pale face, those unsettlingly reflective glasses. No gender-specific features stood out. The person's anonymity somehow made them more threatening. "Evening," I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the quiet. The figure didn't respond or acknowledge my greeting in any way, just continued that unnervingly direct stare. At 15 yards, Ren's behavior changed dramatically. His tail lowered, and a low rumble began in his throat, not quite a growl, but a warning. In 3 years, I'd never heard him make such a sound. The hair on the back of my neck rose in response. 10 yards. I could see the figure clearly now. A stranger, definitely not someone from our neighborhood. Their facial expression remained hidden behind those reflective lenses, but their posture communicated a terrible intentness. Lips pressed into a thin line. No movement. No breath visible in the cold air. 5 yards. We were almost parallel now. I felt caught in a horrible gravity, unable to look away as we drew even with this silent observer. Then, just as we came alongside them, the figure did something that sent a jolt of pure terror through me. They began to move, backward, matching my pace exactly, maintaining the same distance. Those reflective lenses never wavering from my face. The backward movement was so deliberate, so unnatural, that for a moment I couldn't process what I was seeing. Normal people don't walk backward with such precision, maintaining perfect eye contact without tripping or hesitating. Yet this person did exactly that, each step synchronized with mine as if we were partners in some macabre dance. Ren exploded into frenzied barking. The sudden noise shattered the night silence, making me flinch. His body strained against the leash, hackles raised, teeth bared, a protective fury I'd never witnessed in my gentle companion. "Easy." "Ren," I gasped, struggling to maintain control as he lunged toward the figure. The stranger didn't react to Ren's aggression. No flinch, no raised hands in defense, no quickened pace, just that steady backward movement, those reflective eyes fixed on mine. My heart hammered against my ribs. Every instinct screamed danger, yet I couldn't identify exactly what threatened me. No weapon was visible. No words had been spoken. Just this bizarre, coordinated movement that defied normal human interaction. I tried to speed up, hoping to break whatever strange connection had formed between us. The figure matched my increased pace perfectly, still moving backward, still staring. I slowed down. They slowed too, maintaining that precise distance. "What do you want?" I finally managed to ask, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound assertive. No response. Just that unwavering stare and mechanical movement. Ren's barking grew more frantic. He pulled so hard that the leash cut into my hand, the pain barely registering through my adrenaline. The street suddenly felt too empty, the houses too dark. Every potential ally sleeping behind locked doors. I noticed another detail that sent a wave of revulsion through me. The figure's feet seemed to glide rather than step. Their movement was too smooth, too coordinated for someone walking backward without looking. And despite the wet pavement, I heard no footsteps, no scrape of sole against concrete. The intersection of Maple and Birch was about 30 yards ahead, better lit and closer to the main road. If I could reach it, maybe I could flag down a passing car, or at least have more options for escape. Without warning, I yanked Ren's leash and bolted toward the intersection. His surprise at my sudden movement lasted only a second before he matched my pace, still barking wildly. I risked a glance backward, expecting to see the figure in pursuit. What I saw instead was worse. They had pivoted smoothly and were now walking forward, maintaining the same distance, that same measured pace. Their gait was wrong somehow, too fluid, each step identical to the last, like a poorly rendered animation. The intersection seemed miles away. My lungs burned, legs pumping furiously. Ren raced alongside me, his barks punctuating each stride. The sound of my own panicked breathing filled my ears, drowning out everything else. When we finally reached the intersection, I spun around, preparing for confrontation. The street behind us was empty. The figure had vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. I stood at the intersection, gasping for breath, scanning in all directions. Ren continued to bark, facing back the way we had come, his body rigid with alertness. The streetlights buzzed overhead, their light suddenly seeming inadequate against the darkness that pressed in from all sides. Where did they go? I whispered, more to myself than to Ren. It seemed impossible for someone to disappear so completely in the few seconds it had taken us to reach the intersection. There were no side streets, no alleyways, nowhere to hide except behind the neatly landscaped yards of the sleeping houses. A car approached, its headlights sweeping across us. For a terrible moment I feared it might be the stranger, somehow having circled around. But it was just a late-night commuter, probably heading home from a shift similar to mine. They slowed slightly as they passed, perhaps wondering why a woman and her dog were standing frozen at an intersection in the middle of the night. The normalcy of the passing car grounded me somewhat. I tugged Ren's leash gently. "Come on, boy. Let's go home." We took the long way back, sticking to the main streets where the lighting was better. Every shadow made me jump. Every rustle sounded like footsteps. Ren remained on high alert, his ears swiveling at each noise. His pace hurried, as if he too couldn't wait to be safely indoors. When we finally reached our house, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly that it took 3 attempts to get the door unlocked. Once inside, I slammed it shut and engaged every lock, deadbolt chain, even the rarely used sliding bolt at the bottom. The familiar confines of my living room should have provided comfort, but instead, the windows seemed like vulnerable points, each one a potential frame for that reflective stare. I moved through the house, checking locks, closing blinds, turning on lights, then turning them off again when I realized they made me visible while obscuring what might be outside. Ren paced nervously, whining and checking the windows himself. His earlier protective fury now transformed into anxious vigilance. I filled a glass with water and drank it in gulps, trying to steady my nerves. What had I just experienced? The rational part of my brain searched for explanations. A prankster targeting random nightwalkers. Someone with mental health issues. A performance artist pushing boundaries of social interaction. None of these explanations address the wrongness of the movement, the perfect coordination, the complete silence. And none explained Wren's reaction, my steady, friendly dog, who had never shown aggression toward anyone. I sat on the edge of the couch, phone in hand, debating who to call. The police! What would I tell them? That someone walked backward and scared me? No laws had been broken, no threats made. Just that terrible silent watching and unnatural movement. My supervisor at the hospital? She'd probably attribute it to fatigue after a difficult shift. My ex-husband? He'd use it as further evidence that I was too high-strung. The same criticism he'd leveled during our marriage. In the end, I called no one. What could anyone do now anyway? The encounter was over. I was safe inside my home. By morning, it would probably seem like an exaggeration born of exhaustion and darkness, but as I finally crawled into bed, Wren curled protectively at my feet. I couldn't shake the image of those reflective glasses. Twin circles of light hiding whatever eyes lay behind them. Eyes that had watched me with such focused intensity that it felt like a physical touch. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house settling, every distant car passing, every whisper of wind against the windows kept me rigid with alertness. Dawn, when it finally came, brought little relief. The next day passed in a haze of exhaustion and unease. I called in sick to work, something I rarely did, but the thought of returning home in the dark after another night shift was unbearable. Instead, I spent the day securing my house, checking window locks, installing a new chain on the back door, ordering a security camera system that promised next-day delivery. Wren stayed unusually close, following me from room to room, his usual playfulness subdued. Whenever the mail carrier approached or a delivery truck rumbled by, he rushed to the window, hackles raised, until he confirmed it wasn't a threat. By afternoon, lack of sleep and constant vigilance had left me jittery and irrational. Every passing pedestrian visible through my blinds became a potential danger. I found myself studying their gaits, their postures, searching for similarities to the figure from the night before. I tried researching online, typing vague queries like stranger walking backward, reflective glasses stalker, and unusual stalking behaviors. The results were unhelpful. Urban legends, horror movie plots, psychological studies on unusual human movement. Nothing that matched my experience. As evening approached, I faced a dilemma. Wren needed his walk. He'd been inside all day, but the thought of venturing out made my stomach knot with anxiety. The sun was still up, I reasoned. Daylight made everything safer, more normal. We would stay on the main road, avoid the side streets, and keep it brief. Just a quick one, I promised Wren, as I reluctantly clipped on his leash. His enthusiasm was muted, his usual pre-walk excitement tempered by his own lingering wariness. Outside, the neighborhood looked different in daylight. Ordinary, benign. Neighbors mowed lawns. Children played in driveways. Cars came and went in the rhythm of suburban life. The previous night's terror seemed distant, almost imagined. We stuck to our plan, walking only on the busiest street, nodding to neighbors, keeping a brisk pace. No sign of anyone unusual, no reflective glasses or strange movements. By the time we returned home, my shoulders had begun to unknot, my breathing to ease. See, nothing to worry about, I told Wren, who seemed equally relieved to be back inside. Maybe it had been a one-time encounter, some strange anomaly never to be repeated. That fragile comfort shattered when night fell. Darkness transformed my windows into black mirrors, reflecting the interior lights while hiding whatever might be outside. I found myself constantly checking them, expecting to see that figure standing in my yard, watching, waiting. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and dream-plagued. In my nightmares, I walked endless suburban streets, always aware of someone behind me, matching my pace exactly. When I turned to confront them, they were gone, only to appear ahead of me, those reflective lenses catching non-existent light. I woke gasping at 3:17 a.m., convinced I'd heard something outside my bedroom window. Wren was already alert, staring at the blinds, a low growl building in his throat. I froze, listening intently. Nothing, just the normal sounds of the night, distant traffic, the hum of the refrigerator, the central air cycling on. Still, I couldn't shake the certainty that someone was out there. I reached for my phone, finger hovering over the emergency call button. What would I say? That I had a feeling? That my dog was growling at the window? After 10 minutes of paralyzing indecision, I forced myself to get up and look. Pulling back the blind a fraction of an inch, I peered into my backyard. The security light illuminated the empty patio, the still swing set left by the previous owners, the fence line beyond. Nothing moved. No figure stood watching. I sagged with relief, chiding myself for overreacting. Yet even as I returned to bed, I couldn't recapture any sense of security. Ren remained vigilant, his eyes fixed on the window, his body tense. Neither of us slept again that night. 3 days passed. I returned to work, functioning on minimal sleep and maximum caffeine. My colleagues noticed my distraction, the dark circles under my eyes, but attributed it to the usual stresses of the job. I didn't correct them. How could I explain what was happening without sounding unhinged? The security cameras arrived, and I installed them myself. One covering the front yard, one for the back, another monitoring the side of the house where my bedroom window faced. Their presence provided some comfort, a technological shield against the unexplainable. Ren's walks became daytime-only affairs, quick utilitarian outings that kept us within sight of the house. At night, I let him use the backyard, standing guard at the door while he did his business, rushing him back inside at the slightest unusual sound. By the 4th night, exhaustion had begun to override fear. I needed real sleep, unbroken by paranoia and nightmares. After my shift ended, I drove home with the radio blaring to keep myself alert. Pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment, gathering the energy to move. The dashboard clock read 1:42 a.m. The neighborhood was still. Houses dark except for the occasional porch light. Normal, safe. I was being ridiculous, letting one strange encounter upend my entire life. I let myself into the house, greeted Ren with our usual quiet affection, and decided that tonight would be different. We would take our normal walk, reclaim our routine, stop letting fear dictate our lives. What do you think, buddy? Ready for a real walk? I asked. Ren's tail wagged tentatively, as if he wasn't sure whether to be excited or concerned. We set out under clear skies, no recent rain to create those reflective puddles from nights before. I'd brought a flashlight this time, its beam stronger than my phone's light. We took our usual route, my confidence growing with each uneventful block. The neighborhood seemed peaceful, the only sounds our footsteps and Ren's occasional sniffing investigations. We had completed almost the entire circuit, were just 2 blocks from home, when Ren stopped suddenly, his body going rigid. I followed his gaze down the street ahead of us. At first I saw nothing. Then movement caught my eye, a figure emerging from between 2 houses, stepping onto the sidewalk about 100 yards ahead. Even at this distance, recognition hit me with physical force. The height, the posture, the dark coat, and most tellingly, those glasses catching the streetlight in twin circles of reflection. Ren's growl vibrated through the leash into my hand. Fight or flight surged through my system, my body flooding with adrenaline. This time I chose fight. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking the night silence. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure didn't respond or acknowledge my shout. Instead, it began walking toward us with that same measured pace I remembered, each step identical to the last, creating an impression of gliding rather than walking. I raised my flashlight, aiming the beam directly at them. The light hit those reflective lenses and bounced back at me, momentarily blinding me. When my vision cleared, the figure had stopped, standing perfectly still about 50 yards away. "I've called the police," I lied, voice shaking despite my attempt at bravado. "They're on their way right now." Still no response. Just that terrible stillness, that focused attention. Then slowly, deliberately, the figure raised one hand, not in greeting or threat, but to adjust those reflective glasses, pushing them higher on the bridge of their nose. The gesture was so ordinary, so human, that it somehow made everything worse. This wasn't some supernatural entity or hallucination. This was a person deliberately terrorizing me. Ren's growl deepened, his body trembling with restraint. I had a sudden terrible certainty that if I released his leash, he would attack, and that the figure wanted exactly that. "Stay back," I warned, my free hand fumbling for my phone. This time I really would call the police. This was harassment, stalking, something tangible I could report. Before I could unlock my screen, the figure did something new. They tilted their head, a subtle movement that conveyed curiosity or consideration. Then with deliberate slowness, they began to smile, a wide, empty expression that never reached whatever eyes lay behind those reflective lenses. That smile broke something in me. I turned and ran, dragging Ren with me, no longer caring about appearing afraid or vulnerable. All that mattered was distance, escape, the safety of walls and locks and lights. We fled down unfamiliar side streets, taking random turns, my only goal to get away from that terrible smile and those watching eyes. When we finally stumbled onto our street, approaching our house from the opposite direction than usual, I was gasping for breath, legs burning, terror, a metallic taste in my mouth. I burst through the front door, slamming it behind us, engaging every lock with frantic haste. Ren paced and whined, still agitated. I collapsed against the door, sliding down until I sat on the floor, phone clutched in my shaking hand. This time, I did call the police. When the operator answered, I struggled to explain. A stalker, someone following me on my walks, the strange behavior, the evident targeting. The dispatcher was professional but skeptical. Without a direct threat or trespass, there wasn't much they could do. They promised to send a patrol car through the neighborhood, took my information, and advised me to stay inside. Not exactly the response I'd hoped for, but what had I expected? They couldn't arrest someone for walking strangely or wearing reflective glasses. I spent the rest of the night checking my security camera feeds, watching for any sign of the figure approaching my property. Nothing appeared. No strange silhouette. No reflective glasses. Just the empty street and still yards of my sleeping neighborhood. A week passed. Then two. No further sightings occurred, despite my constant vigilance. The patrol car the police had promised drove by a few times, but found nothing suspicious to report. Life began to resume its normal rhythm, though I remained cautious. No more night walks, no more shortcuts through poorly lit areas. I installed additional security lights around my house, bought a Ring camera for my front door, considered, then rejected the idea of getting a gun. My hospital had seen too many accidental shootings for me to feel comfortable with a firearm. Gradually, reluctantly, I began to wonder if I had overreacted. Perhaps the figure had been just a socially awkward person with an unusual gait. Perhaps their silent watching had been social anxiety rather than malice. Perhaps their backward walking had been some personal eccentricity rather than a deliberate attempt to frighten me. Yet Ren's reaction troubled these rationalizations. My gentle dog had recognized something threatening before I had responded with unprecedented aggression. Animals sensed things humans missed. Wasn't that common knowledge? 3 weeks after the second sighting, I was working a particularly difficult shift. A multi-vehicle accident on the interstate had brought in several critical patients simultaneously, stretching our ER team to its limits. By the time things calmed down, I was 2 hours past my scheduled departure, dead on my feet with exhaustion. The hospital parking garage was nearly empty when I finally reached it. Just a scattered few cars belonging to night shift workers. My footsteps echoed between concrete pillars as I made my way to my assigned space on the 3rd level. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, some flickering with age, creating strobing patches of shadow and light. I kept my keys clutched in my hand, a habit ingrained in all hospital workers who left at odd hours. I was almost to my car when I heard it. Footsteps behind me, perfectly matching my pace. I stopped. The steps stopped too, the echo dying away into silence. I turned slowly, expecting to see another hospital employee heading to their vehicle. Instead, I saw that familiar silhouette standing motionless about 20 yards away, those glasses reflecting the fluorescent glare. My throat closed. Here, away from home, away from Wren, away from any neighbors who might respond to a scream, this was where they had chosen to confront me. "What do you want?" I managed to ask, my voice bouncing off the concrete walls. "Why are you following me?" For the first time they spoke. A voice neither distinctly male nor female, calm and oddly familiar. "Don't you recognize me?" The question froze me in place. I squinted, trying to see past those reflective lenses to make out features in the shadowed face. "We should," they continued, taking a step forward. "We work together, after all." Confusion replaced some of my fear. "A co-worker?" I tried to match the voice to someone at the hospital, someone on my shift, but the garage acoustics distorted the sound. They took another step forward, then reached up and removed the glasses. Without the reflection obscuring their face, I finally saw them clearly. Recognition hit me like a physical blow. It was Wyatt from radiology. Quiet, reserved Wyatt, who I passed in hallways several times a week, but rarely spoke to. Wyatt, who had asked me out 6 months ago, who I had gently declined, who had seemed to accept the rejection with good grace. "Wyatt," I whispered, disbelief coloring my voice. "What are you doing? Why are you doing this?" He smiled, that same empty expression I had seen on the street. "You never really saw me before. At work, I'm just background to you. But now you notice me, don't you? Now you think about me even when I'm not there." A cold understanding dawned. The stalking, the strange behavior, the deliberate terror. It had all been to force me to pay attention to him, to make himself unforgettable in my mind. "You've been watching my house," I said, the pieces falling into place, "following me on my walks." He nodded, seeming pleased that I understood. "I learned your routines, when you walk that dog, which windows you leave unlocked, how you always check under your car, but never behind it." My skin crawled at the invasion, the violation of privacy, the deliberate cultivation of fear. Why the backward walking, the silence? "It worked, didn't it?" he asked, tilting his head in that now familiar gesture. "Got your attention. Made you remember me. Made you think about me all the time." I took a step backward, bumping into my car. My hand tightened around my keys, the longest one protruding between my fingers in the self-defense position taught in hospital safety seminars. "This stops now," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I'm reporting you." "To the police, to hospital security, to administration." His smile faltered for the first time. "They won't believe you. It'll be your word against mine. A few walks through your neighborhood. That's not illegal. I never threatened you. Never even spoke to you until now. I have camera footage," I lied. My security cameras hadn't captured him, but he didn't know that. Uncertainty flickered across his face. "You're lying. Want to risk your job to find out?" I countered, finding strength in his hesitation. "Want to risk your license? Your freedom?" We stood in stalemate, the fluorescent lights humming above us, the empty garage stretching around us. Then something changed in his expression, the intensity fading, replaced by calculation. "It doesn't matter," he said finally. "I accomplished what I wanted. You'll never forget me now. Every time you walk that dog, every time you hear footsteps behind you, every time you see someone wearing glasses like these," he held them up, "you'll think of me. I'll always be there in your mind." The truth of his words settled like ice in my stomach. He had altered my sense of safety, inserted himself permanently into my consciousness. Even if he never approached me again, the damage was done. He must have seen the realization on my face, because his smile returned, satisfied now. "See, I matter to you now." Without another word, he placed the glasses back on his face, turned, and walked away. Normally this time, no backward movement, no synchronized pace. Just a man walking to the stairwell, disappearing through the door, as if our encounter had been nothing more than a casual workplace conversation. I stood frozen until the door closed behind him. Then I fumbled with my phone, called hospital security, and reported everything. They arrived quickly, took my statement, reviewed the garage security footage which had indeed captured our interaction, though not his admission. In the following days, official complaints were filed, restraining orders processed, HR meetings held. Wyatt was suspended pending investigation, then terminated when garage footage confirmed his presence near my car on multiple previous occasions. The police took statements, but warned me that without direct threats, prosecution would be difficult. The restraining order was the best protection the legal system could offer against this particular brand of psychological terrorism. I moved out of my house the following month, finding an apartment in a secured building with 24-hour doorman, changed hospitals, changed my routine, took self-defense classes, bought a stronger flashlight that doubled as a striking tool. But Wyatt had been right about one thing. I never forgot. Even now, years later, in a different city with a different job, I still check the reflection of glasses when I pass strangers on the street. I still listen for footsteps that match my pace too perfectly. I still wake sometimes, certain I've heard movement outside my window. The greatest horror isn't in supernatural threats or monstrous creatures. It's in the ordinary human who decides, for reasons you may never fully understand, to make you the focus of their disturbed attention. It's in the realization that the barrier between normal life and consuming fear is thinner than you ever imagined. And it's in knowing that while restraining orders and security systems can keep a person physically distant, nothing can remove them from the corridors of your mind once they've taken up residence there. Wren still barks sometimes at seemingly nothing, his eyes fixed on empty spaces. In those moments, I wonder if he senses something I cannot, or if he too carries the memory of that figure with the reflective glasses, walking backward in perfect synchronization, watching us with that terrible focused intent. I wonder if he, like me, is still walking that night road in his dreams, forever approaching a silhouette that never comes fully into view, forever feeling those hidden eyes tracking our every move. Sometimes I think the greatest power we give to those who terrorize us is not our fear in the moment, but the permanent space we create for them in our minds afterward. The psychic real estate we can never quite reclaim. That, perhaps, is the true victory Wyatt claimed that night in the parking garage. Not just that he made me afraid, but that he made himself unforgettable. And in the darkest hours of the night, when sleep abandons me and every sound becomes a potential warning, I still find myself wondering if he's out there somewhere, watching, waiting, his glasses catching the light in twin circles of reflection, his smile empty of everything except satisfaction at a terror perfectly crafted and delivered. I was 19 that summer of 2019, staying at my grandparents' old farmhouse outside Azal, Texas, trying to get my head straight after dropping out of college. The weight of disappointing my family pressed down on me like the oppressive August heat, and I needed space to think. That particular afternoon, with the sun hanging low and casting everything in amber light, I decided to take a walk through the woods behind the property. These weren't just any woods to me. I'd been exploring them since I was 7 years old, when my parents first started leaving me here for extended summer visits. Every trail, every fallen log, every clearing was mapped in my memory like the layout of my childhood bedroom. The rusted barbed wire fence that marked the property line, the deer path that meandered toward the creek, the ancient oak with the lightning scar, it was all as familiar as breathing. The farmhouse sat on 43 acres, most of it dense woodland that my grandfather had never bothered to clear. He'd always said the trees were good for keeping the wind down and the soil from washing away during the spring rains. My grandmother used to warn me about going too deep into the woods alone, but she worried about everything: snakes, wild hogs, getting lost, breaking an ankle in a hidden hole. Normal dangers that any country kid learns to navigate. That day felt different from the moment I stepped off the back porch. The air hung thick and still, unusual for late afternoon when the breeze typically picked up. Even the insects seemed muted, their usual symphony reduced to an occasional chirp or buzz. I chalked it up to the heat. It had been hovering around 98 degrees for 3 straight days, the kind of weather that makes everything sluggish and strange. I followed my usual route, past the old chicken coop that hadn't housed birds in 20 years, around the massive stump where my grandfather used to split firewood, and into the tree line where the path became less defined. My sneakers crunched through the carpet of dead leaves and pine needles, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet. Usually I found the solitude peaceful, but something about the oppressive silence made my skin crawl. About 10 minutes into my walk, I called out, "Mom!" just to break the quiet, even though I knew she was back at the house helping my grandmother with dinner preparations. My voice seemed to get swallowed by the trees, producing no echo, no response from the wildlife. It was as if the sound just died the moment it left my mouth. The unease started then, creeping up my spine like cold fingers. I'd spent hundreds of hours in these woods and never felt anything like this, a sense of being watched, of the very air around me holding its breath. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just on edge from the stress of recent life changes. Dropping out of school, disappointing my parents, having no clear direction for my future, it was enough to make anyone paranoid. But as I continued deeper into the woods, following the familiar path toward the creek, the feeling intensified. The shadows seemed darker than they should have been, stretching in directions that didn't match the sun's position. Every rustle of leaves made me turn my head, expecting to see a squirrel or bird, but finding nothing. The ordinary sounds I'd grown up with, the crack of settling wood, the scurry of small animals through underbrush, now carried an ominous weight. I was about a quarter-mile from the house when I heard it the first time. My name, called in what sounded like my mother's voice, but stretched and distorted like a recording played at the wrong speed. It came from somewhere ahead of me, deeper in the woods, which made no sense. My mother had been in the kitchen when I left, and she never ventured this far into the trees. "Mom," I called back, stopping in the middle of the path. "Is that you? Do you need help?" Silence. Not even the sound of footsteps moving away or toward me. Just that oppressive, unnatural quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums. I stood there for what felt like minutes, scanning the trees ahead, looking for any sign of movement. The logical part of my brain supplied reasonable explanations. Maybe it was a neighbor calling their dog. Maybe the heat was affecting my hearing. Maybe I was more stressed than I realized. But something primal in my gut told me to turn around and head back to the house. I'd learned to trust that instinct during my years exploring these woods. It had kept me from stepping on copperheads, warned me away from unstable ground near the creek, alerted me to the presence of the occasional wild hog. Now it was screaming at me to leave, to get back to safety, to not investigate that voice any further. I should have listened. Instead of heeding my instincts, I took 3 more steps down the path. That's when I heard it again, my name. But this time the voice carried a quality that made my stomach clench. It was my mother's voice, I was certain of that, but wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Too high in some syllables, too low in others, like someone trying to imitate her speech patterns without quite getting it right. "Where are you?" The voice called, and now I could tell it was coming from behind a cluster of pine trees about 50 yards ahead. "I need to show you something." My mother had never said those words to me before, at least not in that tone. When she needed to show me something, she'd call me into the kitchen or living room, not lure me deeper into the woods with cryptic messages. The wrongness of it hit me like a physical blow, and I felt my heart rate spike. "Mom, where exactly are you?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "This isn't funny." No response. But now I could hear something else, a rustling sound, like someone moving through the underbrush, but moving wrong. Too slow, too deliberate, with pauses that lasted too long between steps. A person walking through woods makes a certain rhythm of sounds. Footfalls, brush being pushed aside, the occasional snap of a twig. This was different. It sounded like something large, dragging itself forward, stopping periodically as if listening. I backed up 2 steps, my rational mind warring with a growing sense of panic. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe someone was playing a prank, though that seemed unlikely given our remote location. Maybe there was an injured hiker in the woods who needed help. Maybe my mother really had followed me and was having some kind of medical episode that was affecting her speech. But even as I ran through these possibilities, my body was preparing to run. My muscles tensed, my breathing became shallow, and sweat that had nothing to do with the heat began forming on my forehead. Every survival instinct I possessed was firing at once, flooding my system with adrenaline. The rustling sound grew closer, and with it came something else, a smell. It was faint at first, almost masked by the normal forest scents of decomposing leaves and pine sap. But as it grew stronger, I recognized it as something organic and wrong. Not the clean smell of a healthy animal or person, but something that reminded me of roadkill that had been sitting in the sun too long, or the time a raccoon had died in our attic and we didn't find it for a week. "Come closer," the voice called again, and this time I was certain it wasn't my mother. The pitch was all wrong, and there was an undertone to it that sounded like vocal cords that weren't quite human, trying to form human words. "I found something you need to see." I took another step backward, then another. Whatever was in those trees ahead of me, it wasn't my mother, wasn't a neighbor, wasn't any person I'd ever encountered. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe someone with a severe speech impediment. Maybe a recording being played through a speaker. Maybe auditory hallucinations brought on by stress and heat. But the smell was getting stronger. And underneath the rustling, I could now hear what sounded like labored breathing. Heavy, wet, with a quality that suggested damaged lungs or throat. It was the kind of breathing you might hear from someone who'd been a heavy smoker for decades, but amplified and distorted. That's when I saw the first glimpse of movement between the trees. Something tall and pale, moving with an unnatural gait that seemed to involve too many joints bending in the wrong directions. It was still partially obscured by the pine branches, but what I could see made my vision blur around the edges with the beginnings of panic. The thing was roughly human-shaped, but wrong in every detail. Too tall, too thin, with skin that looked mottled and damaged like it had been burned or diseased. What I had initially taken for clothing appeared to be more skin, hanging in loose folds that swayed as it moved. And its proportions were all off. Arms that hung too low, a neck that seemed too long, hands that ended in what looked like darkened, overgrown fingernails. I couldn't move. Every muscle in my body had locked up as my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. The thing emerged further from behind the trees, and I got a clearer view of its face. It was the worst part, vaguely human features arranged in a configuration that sent waves of revulsion through me. The eyes were too large and set too far apart, with no visible whites, just dark pupils that seemed to reflect the fading sunlight like an animal's. The mouth was wrong too, stretched too wide and filled with teeth that were too pointed, too numerous, overlapping each other like they'd grown in without any pattern or purpose. But it was moving toward me with purpose, not shambling randomly like a sick animal. Its gait was deliberate, calculated, and there was an intelligence in those dark eyes that was somehow worse than if it had just been a mindless predator. This thing was thinking, planning, evaluating me as it approached. The smell intensified as it got closer, and I could now identify other components mixed in with the decay. Something metallic, like old blood. Something chemical, like cleaning fluid, and underneath it all, something that reminded me of the smell that clings to your hands after handling raw meat that's just starting to turn. "Don't run," it said in my mother's voice. But now I could see that the words weren't coming from a mouth that could properly form them. The lips moved wrong, the tongue wasn't the right color, and there was a wet, clicking sound accompanying each syllable. "I have something wonderful to show you." My paralysis broke like a snapped cable. I spun around and ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, crashing through branches and underbrush without any concern for the path. Behind me, I could hear it following but not running, making that same deliberate rustling movement as if it knew I couldn't escape and saw no need to hurry. The woods seemed to have changed around me. Paths I'd known for years no longer led where they should. Trees I'd climbed as a child appeared to have moved, blocking routes that should have been clear. The shadows had deepened, despite the sun still being visible through the canopy, and every direction looked the same, dense, dark, and threatening. I could hear my own panicked breathing, the crash of my footsteps through the undergrowth, the hammering of my heart in my ears. But underneath all of that, I could still hear the thing behind me, moving with that horrible patience, occasionally calling my name in voices that belonged to people I knew, but twisted into something obscene. My grandmother's voice. "Where are you going, sweetie?" My grandfather's voice. "Come back here, boy." My father's voice. "Don't make me come find you." Each one perfect in tone and inflection, but wrong in context and timing, like someone had recorded conversations and was playing them back at inappropriate moments. The thing was learning the voices of my family, collecting them somehow, and using them against me. I stumbled over a root and went down hard, scraping my palms and knees on the rough ground. As I scrambled to get back up, I risked a glance over my shoulder. The thing was maybe 30 yards behind me, moving through the trees with an ease that suggested it knew these woods better than I did. It wasn't hurrying because it didn't need to. I was running blind through terrain it had mapped out long before I arrived. When I looked at it directly, more details became horribly clear. Its skin wasn't just pale and damaged. It was covered in what looked like surgical scars, precise lines that crisscrossed its torso and limbs like a medical diagram. Some of the scars were old and healed, while others appeared fresh, still seeping a dark fluid that stained the loose folds of skin around them. Its hair was sparse and grew in irregular patches, some areas completely bald, while others had long, stringy strands that moved independent of any breeze. And its hands, its hands were the worst part. The fingers were too long and ended in what I had initially mistaken for overgrown nails, but now realized were something else entirely. They looked surgical, metallic, like instruments that had been grafted onto human bones. I forced myself to look away and concentrate on running, but the image was burned into my mind. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural. It looked like something that had been constructed, assembled from parts that were never meant to go together. The surgical scars suggested someone had been experimenting, modifying, improving on some basic design in ways that violated every law of biology and decency. The thought that a human being might have created this thing was almost worse than believing it was some unknown species. At least a monster born from nature might have some comprehensible motivation, hunger, territory, reproduction. But something made by human hands implied a purpose that was purely malevolent, created for the sake of causing suffering. I reached a small clearing I recognized and oriented myself toward the house. I was still about half a mile away, but I could run that distance if I could just maintain my pace and avoid falling again. The thing behind me had fallen silent, which was somehow worse than hearing it move. At least when I could track its position, I knew where the threat was coming from. The silence stretched on as I ran, broken only by my own labored breathing and the sound of my feet hitting the ground. I began to hope that maybe I'd lost it, that maybe it had given up the chase and returned to whatever hole it had crawled out of. But just as I was starting to feel a glimmer of relief, I heard my own voice calling out from somewhere ahead of me. "Help me! Someone help me!" It was my voice, perfect in every detail, coming from the direction I was running. The thing had somehow gotten ahead of me, and now it was using my own voice to try to lure my family into the woods. The thought of my grandmother or grandfather hearing what they thought was me calling for help and venturing into these trees made my stomach lurch with panic. I veered to the right, abandoning the direct path home, in favor of a longer route that would keep me away from wherever the thing was positioned. But as soon as I changed direction, I heard my voice again, this time from my new heading. "I'm hurt. I can't walk. Please help me." It was moving with me, staying ahead of my position, using my voice to create an expanding perimeter of false distress calls. And they were convincing. If I hadn't known better, I would have believed someone was genuinely in trouble. The thing had somehow learned not just the sound of my voice, but the emotional patterns, the way I would actually sound if I were injured and scared. I stopped running and tried to think. The thing was faster than me and knew the woods better than I did. It could apparently move silently when it wanted to, and it was intelligent enough to use psychological warfare. Running blindly wasn't going to work. I needed a strategy. The farmhouse had several outbuildings, a barn, a tool shed, an old root cellar that my grandfather had dug in the 1960s. If I could reach one of them, I might be able to hide until someone came looking for me, or at least put a solid barrier between myself and whatever was hunting me. I chose the barn as my destination. It was sturdy, had multiple exit points, and contained tools that could potentially be used as weapons. More importantly, it was visible from the house. So if the thing followed me there, my family would be more likely to notice something was wrong. I started moving again, but more carefully this time, trying to stay quiet and avoid the obvious paths. The thing seemed to have anticipated this strategy, because I could hear my voice calling out from multiple directions now, creating a chorus of false distress calls that would confuse anyone trying to locate the real me. "I'm lost. I can't find my way back. Something bit me." I think it was a snake. "I fell in the creek. The current is too strong." Each call was perfectly crafted to inspire immediate action from anyone who heard it. My grandmother would come running with the first aid kit. My grandfather would grab his shotgun and his flashlight. My mother would call 911. The thing was trying to draw them all into the woods, where it could do to them whatever it had planned for me. I had to get to the house and warn them before they heard these calls and came looking for me. But every time I tried to move toward home, the voices would shift to block my path, always staying just ahead of me, always calling out in that perfect imitation of my distressed voice. After 20 minutes of this deadly game of cat and mouse, I finally saw the barn through the trees. It looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Weathered red wood, rusted tin roof, the big sliding door slightly ajar the way my grandfather always left it. Normal, safe, a refuge from the nightmare that was pursuing me through the woods. I sprinted the last 100 yards, burst through the gap in the sliding door, and immediately started looking for something to bar it shut. The barn was filled with the usual collection of farm equipment, old furniture, and decades of accumulated junk that my grandfather couldn't bring himself to throw away. I grabbed a heavy workbench and dragged it in front of the door, then piled several bags of feed on top of it for extra weight. Only then did I allow myself to stop and catch my breath. The barn smelled like hay and motor oil and old wood, normal smells that helped ground me in reality after the horror in the woods. I could see the house through the window, warm light spilling from the kitchen where my family was probably wondering where I'd gone for so long. I needed to get to them and warn them about the voices they might hear. But I also needed a weapon in case the thing followed me. I looked around the barn and found my grandfather's old deer rifle hanging on the wall. I'd used it before during hunting season, so I knew how to load and fire it. There was a box of ammunition on the shelf below it. As I loaded the rifle, I tried to make sense of what I'd encountered. The thing in the woods wasn't like anything I'd ever heard of, even in the wildest urban legends or horror stories. It was too sophisticated, too purposeful, too obviously artificial. Someone had made it, which meant someone knew it existed, knew what it was capable of. But who? And why? And why here in these particular woods that I'd considered safe for so many years? I was still puzzling over these questions when I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. My own voice calling out from just outside the barn. "Grandpa? Grandma, I'm in the barn!" Something's wrong with my leg. The voice was coming from the other side of the sliding door, maybe 10 feet away. The thing had followed me here, and now it was trying to lure my family into a trap. I could see the house through the window, could see movement in the kitchen. You could imagine my grandfather reaching for his coat and flashlight to come help his injured grandson. I had to warn them, but I couldn't leave the barn without encountering the thing directly. And I couldn't call out to the house because my voice would be indistinguishable from the fake calls the thing was making. I think I broke something. My voice called out again. It really hurts. Can someone come help me? The performance was flawless. If I didn't know better, I would have believed it myself. The thing had somehow learned not just my voice, but my speech patterns, my vocabulary, even the way I would phrase a request for help. It was like listening to a recording of myself that I didn't remember making. Through the window, I saw the kitchen light go out and the back porch light come on. Someone was coming. I had to do something. I moved to the window and started waving frantically, trying to signal that something was wrong. But the person coming out of the house, it looked like my grandfather, was heading toward the sound of the voice, not looking in my direction. "Grandpa," I shouted through the glass. "Don't come out here! It's not me!" But the window was old and thick, and I don't think he heard me clearly. He kept walking toward the barn, his flashlight beams sweeping back and forth across the ground. The false calls continued, guiding him closer to whatever trap the thing had prepared. I had to make a choice. I could stay hidden in the barn and hope my grandfather would figure out something was wrong before it was too late. Or I could go out there and face the thing directly, maybe buy my grandfather time to get back to the house safely. I chose the latter. I checked the rifle one more time, made sure the safety was off, and moved toward the door. If the thing wanted me, it could have me, but it wasn't going to get my family. I moved the workbench aside as quietly as possible and slipped out through the gap in the door. The thing was standing about 20 feet away, positioned between me and my grandfather, who was still approaching with his flashlight. In the artificial light, the thing looked even more grotesque than it had in the woods. Its skin had a waxy, translucent quality that revealed dark veins underneath. The surgical scars I'd noticed before were more extensive than I'd realized, covering almost every inch of its body in precise geometric patterns. It stood perfectly still, like a mannequin, but its head was turned toward my grandfather, tracking his approach. "I'm over here!" I shouted, raising the rifle. "Grandpa, get back to the house, now!" My grandfather's flashlight beam swung toward me, and I saw his face change as he realized there were two of us. One calling from near the woods, one holding a gun by the barn. The confusion lasted only a second before his expression shifted to understanding and alarm. "Get inside!" I yelled again. "Call the police!" The thing turned toward me, and I got my first clear look at its face in artificial light. It was worse than I'd imagined. The features were human enough to be recognizable, but wrong enough to trigger every revulsion response in my brain. The eyes weren't just large and dark. They were compound, like an insect's, made up of hundreds of smaller lenses that reflected the flashlight beam. The mouth was filled with what I'd thought were too many teeth. But now I could see they weren't teeth at all. They were needles. Thin metal spikes arranged in concentric circles, like the inside of some nightmare machine. "You found me," it said in my voice. But now I could see how it was making the sound. Its throat distended and contracted like a bellows, forcing air through chambers that weren't designed for human speech. The mouth moved randomly, unconnected to the words being produced. "I've been waiting for you!" I fired the rifle. The bullet caught its center mass, spinning it around and spraying dark fluid across the ground. But instead of falling, it straightened up and looked down at the wound with what I can only describe as mild interest. The hole in its chest was already beginning to close, the edges pulling together like the thing was made of some self-repairing material. "That stung," it said, still using my voice. The mouth had stopped moving entirely now, but the words kept coming, emanating from somewhere inside its torso. Do it again. I fired twice more, both shots hitting center mass. The thing staggered but didn't fall. The wounds sealed themselves within seconds, leaving only dark stains on its mottled skin. Whatever it was made of, conventional weapons weren't going to stop it. Behind me, I could hear my grandfather shouting into his phone, calling 911, describing an intruder on the property. But what was he going to tell them? That his grandson was being threatened by something that looked like a medical experiment gone wrong? That bullets passed through it without effect? That it could perfectly mimic human voices? The thing started walking toward me, moving with that same deliberate, patient gait I'd seen in the woods. Each step was measured, calculated, like it was in no hurry, because it knew the outcome was inevitable. "You can't hurt me," it said in my grandmother's voice now. "But I can hurt you. I can hurt all of you." I backed toward the barn, keeping the rifle raised even though I knew it was useless. The thing followed, closing the distance between us with each step. Behind it, I could see my grandfather running back toward the house, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he moved. "What do you want?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I want to play," it replied in a child's voice I didn't recognize. "I want to learn. I want to practice." Practice what? Being human. Now it was using my father's voice. "It's harder than it looks. So many small details to get right. The way you move your mouth when you talk. The way your eyes track movement. The way you breathe when you're afraid." As it spoke, I noticed its movements were becoming more fluid, more natural. It was learning from watching me, adapting its behavior in real time. The awkward mechanical gait was smoothing out into something that could almost pass for human from a distance. "I've been practicing for a long time," it continued, cycling through voices I recognized. My mother, my grandfather, my high school teacher, friends from college. "But I've never had such good subjects to study. Your family is very expressive, very emotional, very easy to read." The implication hit me like a physical blow. This thing had been watching us, studying us, learning our voices and mannerisms. "For how long?" "Days, weeks, years. How long have you been here?" I asked. "Long enough," it said in my grandmother's voice. "Long enough to know all your routines, all your habits, all your fears." It was close enough now that I could smell it clearly. That mixture of decay and chemicals and something else, something surgical and sterile. Close enough to see that its skin wasn't just scarred, but tattooed with symbols I didn't recognize. Geometric patterns that seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at them. "What are you?" I whispered, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. The thing paused its advance and tilted its head, considering the question. When it spoke again, it used a voice I didn't recognize, flat, electronic, like a computer trying to simulate human speech. "I am an experiment," it said. "A prototype. A proof of concept. For what? Replacement, infiltration, improvement." The voice remained mechanical, emotionless. "Humans are flawed, inefficient, prone to error and emotion and weakness. I'm designed to be better." "Who made you?" "People who understand that evolution is too slow, that waiting for natural selection to improve the species is wasteful. People who have the vision and the resources to accelerate the process." As it spoke, I could hear sirens in the distance getting closer. My grandfather's call to 911 had worked. But what were the police going to do against something that could heal from gunshot wounds? "The first prototypes were crude," the thing continued, seemingly unconcerned about the approaching sirens. "Barely functional. But each iteration improved. Better healing, better mimicry, better adaptation. How many of you are there?" "Enough." "We are placed in rural communities for field testing, to study human behavior in controlled environments, to perfect our disguises before deployment in larger population centers." The casual way it described this made my stomach turn. We weren't people to this thing. We were test subjects, lab rats being studied in a maze. And there were others like it, scattered in small towns and rural areas across the country, learning to be human so they could eventually replace us. What happens when you perfect the disguise? Integration, replacement, the inefficient models are retired. Retired? Eliminated. The sirens were getting closer, maybe a mile away now. I could see flashing lights through the trees. But the thing showed no sign of concern, no indication that it planned to flee or hide. You're not afraid of the police. Why would I be? They will see what I want them to see, hear what I want them to hear. They have no protocols for dealing with something like me. It was right, and we both knew it. What were small-town police officers going to make of this situation? Even if they believed my grandfather's story, even if they saw the thing clearly, they had no training or equipment for dealing with something that could survive multiple gunshot wounds and perfectly mimic human voices. Besides, the thing added, its voice shifting back to my own, I have learned everything I need from this community. My mission here is complete. Mission, data collection, behavioral analysis, infiltration testing. I have successfully integrated into your social structure, learned your communication patterns, and identified the optimal methods for replacement. My mind raced, trying to understand what it was telling me. Had this thing been living among us, replacing people? How many of our neighbors, our friends, our family members were actually these prototypes? Who have you replaced? I asked. The thing smiled, and for the first time, the expression looked genuinely human. That was the most terrifying thing yet. Not its monstrous appearance, but the moment when it looked almost normal. No one yet, it said. But I have identified the optimal targets. People who live alone. People who have minimal social connections. People whose disappearance would take time to notice. It gestured toward the approaching police cars. Like rural police officers who patrol alone at night. The implication hit me like a sledgehammer. This thing wasn't planning to run from the police. It was planning to add them to its collection of voices and identities. It would study them, learn their mannerisms, and then replace them. And who would question a police officer who started acting slightly differently? Who would suspect that their local law enforcement had been replaced by something designed to infiltrate and eliminate human communities? You can't stop this, the thing said, reading my expression. This is just the beginning. We are everywhere now. In your schools, your hospitals, your government buildings, learning, adapting, preparing. The police cars pulled into the driveway, their headlights illuminating the space between the barn and the house. I could see officers getting out, drawing their weapons, calling for backup. Standard procedure for a reported home invasion. The thing looked at them with interest, like a scientist observing a new species of insect. Then it did something that made my knees weak with terror. It changed. Its appearance shifted like water, the monstrous features smoothing out, the surgical scars fading, the unnaturally pale skin darkening to a normal human tone. Within seconds, it looked like a perfectly ordinary person, someone you might pass on the street without a second glance. Thank you for the demonstration, it said in a voice I didn't recognize, but that sounded completely human. Your fear responses were very instructive. The police found me standing by the barn, holding an empty rifle, staring at a man in his 30s who claimed to be a lost hiker. He explained that he'd been calling for help for hours, that he'd gotten turned around in the woods and was trying to find his way back to the main road. He was articulate, calm, and completely convincing. I tried to tell them what had really happened, but my story sounded insane, even to me. A shape-shifting monster that could mimic voices, surgical scars that healed instantly, a conspiracy to replace human beings with artificial duplicates. The officers looked at me with the mixture of concern and skepticism that cops reserve for people having mental health crises. The hiker was sympathetic and understanding. He suggested that I might have been startled by his calls for help and let my imagination run wild in the darkness. He even volunteered to come back another time to make a formal statement, to make sure there were no hard feelings about the misunderstanding. My grandfather backed up my story as best he could, but he'd only seen the end of the encounter, and in the poor lighting, he couldn't be certain of the details. The police took our statements, walked the property with flashlights, and found nothing out of the ordinary. No physical evidence of the creature I'd described. No blood where I'd shot it. No signs of a struggle. The hiker left with them, riding in the back of a patrol car to town where he claimed his vehicle was parked. I watched through the window as the car drove away, and I could swear that in the brief moment before the interior light went out, I saw him looking back at the house with those two dark eyes. That was 3 years ago. I moved away from Texas shortly after, claiming I needed to finish my education. I never went back to my grandparents' farm. I couldn't sleep in those woods again, couldn't walk those familiar paths without wondering what was watching me from the shadows. But leaving didn't help. No matter where I go, I find myself studying faces in crowds, listening for voices that sound just slightly wrong, watching for people who move or speak or behave in ways that seem almost but not quite human. I've learned to recognize the signs. The too perfect posture, the eyes that track movement like cameras, the subtle delays in emotional responses. They're everywhere now, just like the thing told me they would be. Teachers who never seem to age or get sick. Police officers who patrol the same routes with mechanical precision. Store clerks who remember every customer's purchase history but never engage in spontaneous conversation. They're good at their disguises now, but not perfect. Not yet. I've tried to tell people what I know, but who would believe it? Who would take seriously a story about artificial beings designed to replace humanity? Even I sometimes wonder if I've lost my mind. If the stress of that night broke something in my brain that causes me to see threats where none exist. But then I'll catch someone staring at me too intently, or I'll hear a voice that's too perfect, too practiced, and I'll know that I'm not crazy. I'll know that somewhere in a laboratory, scientists are still working to perfect their prototypes. I'll know that the thing in the woods was telling the truth about what was coming. The worst part is the waiting, knowing that one day one of them will complete its mission successfully. Knowing that the people I care about, my family, my friends, my neighbors, might already be gone, replaced by things that wear their faces and speak in their voices, while something fundamentally human has been lost forever. I still live with the fear that I brought to their attention that night, that by encountering one of their prototypes, by surviving long enough to understand what it was, I marked myself as a threat that needs to be eliminated. I change apartments frequently, vary my routines, avoid forming close relationships with anyone who might be used against me. But I also live with the knowledge that I might be the only person who knows the truth about what's happening to our species. The only one who saw behind the mask and lived to tell about it. The only one who can warn others about what's coming, even if no one wants to listen. Sometimes I wonder if that was part of their plan all along. To let me escape. To let me spread a story so outrageous that anyone who hears it will dismiss it as the ravings of a paranoid mind. What better way to discredit the truth than to make it sound like a conspiracy theory? But I keep telling the story anyway, to anyone who will listen. Because somewhere out there in small towns and rural communities across the country, other people might be having encounters like mine. Other people might be seeing things that don't quite fit. Hearing voices that sound almost but not quite right, sensing that something fundamental about their world has changed. And maybe, if enough of us speak up, if enough of us pay attention, we can figure out how to fight back before it's too late. Before the replacement process is complete, before the last truly human voice is silenced forever, leaving only perfect mimics, speaking words they learned from studying our fear. The thing in the woods was right about one thing. This is just the beginning. But it was wrong about another thing. We can stop this. We have to stop this. Because the alternative is a world where humanity exists only as a collection of behavioral patterns, copied and reproduced by things that understand our mannerisms, but not our souls. I've spent 3 years looking over my shoulder, 3 years jumping at shadows, 3 years wondering if today will be the day they come to finish what they started in those Texas woods. But I've also spent 3 years learning, preparing, watching for signs of their presence in the world around me. And now I'm ready to fight back. Because whatever they are, wherever they came from, however they were made, they made one critical error in their design. They can copy our voices, mimic our movements, replicate our social behaviors, but they can't reproduce the one thing that makes us truly human, our willingness to sacrifice everything to protect the people we love. That's a lesson they're going to learn the hard way.